Hello, and welcome to the Newburyport Literary Festival's mini festival, Heroes and High Flyers, honoring the brave men and women who have served our country for the last 250 years. My name is Leslie Hendrickson. I'm on the steering committee of the Newburyport Literary Festival. Just got a few things to tell you before we start. To begin with, we're using the webinar format. So that means that you can see the panelists and hear them, obviously, but they can't see or hear you. So if you have any comments, please use the chat tab down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There will be time for questions at the end, and we would ask that you put those in the Q&A tab, which is also at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We want to support our local bookstores, Jabberwocky and the Bookshop of Beverly Farms. So in the chat, you will find links to those bookstores, and you can buy books from our festival, including the ones we're talking about today, from those shops. We hope that you'll support those bookstores or your local bookstore. So today we're going to be hearing from Katherine Sharp Landdeck. She's the author of The Women with Silver Wings, the inspiring true story of the women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II. She is an associate professor of history at Texas Women University, which is where the WASP archives are located. She's a Guggenheim Fellow at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum and a graduate of the University of Tennessee, where she got her PhD. She's also won numerous awards for her work on the WASP and has appeared as an expert on NPR's Morning Edition, PBS, and the History Channel. In addition, she's a licensed pilot and she flies whenever she can. She's going to do a presentation about the book, and then she's going to be joined by Ghlee Woodworth, who is a local historian in Newburyport and a 12th generation Newburyporter. Wow. Her first publication, Tiptoe Through the Tombstones, Oak Hill Cemetery, won awards from New England and New York book festivals. She's also the creator and author of Newburyport's Clipper Heritage Trail, and Volume 1 will be published this summer. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kate. And Kate, we really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much.
Well,
thank
thank you much.
And we'll see you in a few minutes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for having me. And you know, this whole pandemic situation is not ideal, but it sure is nice to be able to Skype into or Zoom into festivals like this. And I really appreciate you asking me. I'm going to share my screen here for a minute. Let's see if I can get it set up. Can you see that all right? Let me know if you can't. How about that?
Looks great.
Okay, perfect. Well, good. Well, thank you everybody for coming and listening to me talk and supporting your local bookstores and supporting this terrific festival. I've enjoyed looking online at the different work that you all are doing, and I just think it's terrific. So thank you so much. The topic that I'm going to talk about is my book, The Women with Silver Wings, the inspiring true story of the women Air Force Service Pilots of World War II, which came out just last month from Crown Publishing. You can buy it anywhere you'd like, of course. And I'm just excited to have a chance to talk about these women who I first learned about in 1993, about 100 years ago, or in the last century, as my children like to tell me. And I've been studying them ever since and doing different work, documentary films, and work with groups like Morning Edition and different literary groups. And we even did a Tournament of Roses parade float. So just doing lots of different things, but happy to have this book out. I know a lot of people may not know who these women were, so I just want to give you a little basic rundown or understanding of who they were and what they did before we get a chance to talk with Ghlee in a little bit. Everyone knows December 7th, 1941 was a very big deal with Pearl Harbor attack and the United States getting into the war the following day. And when we started this conflict, we were quite unprepared as a nation and not ready to go. And so very quickly we realized that we were short. We were short soldiers, we were short pilots. And pilots really take, 3 to 4 months to train. So this was a big problem that we had. Enter the scene, two very important women to this story. Jacqueline Cochran, pictured here. The picture on the right is one of my very favorite, very, vogue shot of her. She was a prominent air racer, prominent businesswoman in the 1930s, owned her own business, cosmetics company, and was just very well respected, literally the #1 pilot and the female pilot in the world, and very competitive with the men pilots in different air races as well. So Jackie Cochran was one of the women. The second leader of this program was Nancy Harkness Love. Nancy was also a very prominent pilot, not as flashy as Jackie. Nancy did a lot of quieter work, but was still very well respected and well known. She test flew a lot of aircraft and that kind of thing. Just did a lot of great flying. Nancy's grew up in Michigan, but her family was from the Boston area, actually. She went to Milton Academy. There's a story of her actually when she was 16, having her pilot's license. Her brother dared her to buzz the campus, and she pulled up a little low and rattled the tiles off of the roof of the boys' dormitory, apparently. And she didn't get kicked out of the school because the school had rules against girls driving, but not against girls flying. So she was suspended for a little while, but got to come back. But that was Nancy. So both very dynamic women. They started this program with having the women come in as ferry pilots. You've heard of the Rosie the Riveter and all the work that the factories did during World War II to build all those planes that we needed. Well, you had to get those planes from the factories to the coasts, to those points of embarkation, because we had a war in Europe and we had a war in the Pacific. And if you're making, P-51s in Dallas, you have to get them where they need to go. So you have these initial women are a part of the ferry command, and they ferried the planes, where they would get in the planes at the factories and ferry them or fly them to the coasts where they needed to go. Obviously very glamorous with their winter gear there. But it was a big deal to let women be a part of this program. But very quickly they realized there was an opportunity to do more with the women, to expand the work that they did. This is another picture of WASP with P-38. This is my husband's favorite photo, so I could try to include it every time. Right, so they started training more women pilots. There were not that many who were qualified to go straight into the ferry command. So they started training initially in Houston, Texas, which the weather is just not conducive to flight training in Houston. It's very humid, it's a lot of rain. So they moved to West Texas a little bit. This is about 2.5 hours west of Fort Worth, out I-20 near Abilene, Texas. And then this was Sweetwater, Texas. And you can see there's just not a lot there, not a lot of trees, a lot of those low mesquite bushes. And really good for flight training because there's not as much to hit. So they took women to this training base at Avenger Field. 25,000 women applied to the program, 1,830 took part in it, and 1,074 graduated. So you take those top women, and in all you get 1,102 women who served in this program. This is a picture, this is their housing. They were very strict about the women's moral character here in the training program. They called it Cochran's Convent. They, wouldn't let male pilots land there. They, later on in the program, they had just married male pilots as flight instructors and that sort of thing, because they wanted to keep the virtue of these women pure. So they had a lot of fun with this. This is just some of the planes that they flew. They flew everything from old biplanes to things like this. This was an advanced trainer, the AT-6 Texan, which is a high horsepower trainer. It was built here in the Dallas area, but a really sophisticated plane that these women went through. And the training that the women went through was the same as the male pilots. This is another group of WASP. The woman second from the right is actually the aunt of former Attorney General Janet Reno. For those of you who remember Janet Reno, that's her aunt. So Janet Reno grew up knowing these women and you know, considers them her aunts, the whole group of them, because Winnie Wood there was so prominent in her life. So this is the first graduation when they had a very formal lining of the planes and marching in and gathering the women as they came. It was a huge public event and publicity as the women went through training. And the training the women went through consisted of everything from the actual flying of the airplanes, about half the day, to ground school, where they would do different things. This is in the ready room when they're getting ready to go fly, to see which plane they would take. But this was ground school they had every day as well. They had math, they had engines, they had meteorology, they had Morse code, which they all hated universally, where they had to learn that. So this was a good half of their day sitting in, if you can imagine the heat of a Texas summer, being in a classroom in those flight suits, which you could see were all too big for them. They were men's clothes that they were given for their work. They had to do calisthenics every day to keep them strong, to fly those airplanes as well. So that was a big part of the effort as well, just keeping fit. They also had simulator training. This is a Link trainer, and it's just a small little aircraft simulator. You put the top down and follow the instruments on it. So it was a practice of instrument training. This is Hazel Lee. She was one of 2 Chinese Americans in the program. Remember, while we interred Japanese Americans during the war, we were allied with the Chinese. So this was an attempt to bring a little diversity. Otherwise, it was a white program. There was 1 Native American, a few other women who claimed Native heritage, but you know, it was a very white program. This is a time when the armed forces are segregated, and Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Love weren't willing to diversify and to push that challenge as well. This is just one of my very favorite pictures of Avenger Field. This is obviously after a big Texas thunderstorm has gone through. One of the WASP had color film and took some color pictures, and this is just one of my favorites. They did march everywhere. They were technically civilians, but they were treated as military. This is as they prepare to go to graduation. You can see none of them have wings on their chests yet, but they're preparing to march to graduation. One of the things I think is interesting about this program is how hodgepodge it was from the beginning. The women all bought their own clothes here. They bought those pants mainly from Oshman Sporting Goods. They got the shirts from local stores. They borrowed the caps from a nearby men's field. So it was just this hodgepodge group without any set uniform in the beginning. It formalized as they went further, but it was a bit of a mess. In 1943, after they had been ferrying planes for 6 months or so, they decided to expand the program to other types of jobs beyond ferrying. This is in Camp Davis, North Carolina. And I like this picture because you can see how worn out this plane is. You know, all the new planes were going to the combat pilots, as they should have. So the people who are left in the United States are flying pretty worn out planes. You end up with 38 of these women killed during the war, and plane malfunctions was a big part of it. But one of the first jobs they did was they towed targets behind their planes. You have to train the men on the ground to fire their weapons and to shoot down the planes, those young men who are going to war. And the way you do that is you fly a target down the line and let them shoot at you. Usually the ammunition was color-coded, and they would fire on them. None of the women were shot down. That's always asked. They also flew different types of planes, in part to prove that women could do it. to see what women would be able to do if the war got worse. While the Soviet women had women flying combat, the United States never did. But we wanted to see what women could do, what they could fly. So they flew a wide variety of planes. This is a B-17. And this, they actually towed targets behind the B-17s as well for air-to-air gunnery practice. So the men in the backs of the B-17s would have some practice. They usually got 3 rounds before they were shipped overseas, which sounds ridiculously low. Just a couple more pictures. This is Nell Bright is still alive. She's in Salt Lake City right now. I like this picture because you can see her open-toed shoes that she used to like to fly in, and just a lot of fun. They also did some experimental flights. This is a remote-controlled aircraft. The WASP were involved in that program. This is just a really fun picture of them in their winter flying gear, flying at altitude in unheated planes, often in open cockpit biplanes. Right. This is another B-17 photo. You may have seen this one, the pistol packing mamas. This is a group of women that flew, towed those targets behind the B-17 as well. I like this picture because it's got the men over on the right side of the screen, kind of looking at the women going, "What are you doing?" Right. One of the things that they did as well was they were utilized to prove to men that certain planes were safe, that they were so easy that even a woman could do it. And one of the planes was the B-29. This is on the left, there's Paul Tibbets, Colonel Paul Tibbets. He goes on to be general. Paul Tibbets is the pilot who flew the Enola Gay and dropped that first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. But the B-29 was developed during the war. It had a lot of problems. It was sped through production. The engines caught on fire quite frequently. And there was a very famous accident in which some of the very best test pilots at Boeing crashed in a horrible accident. And they crashed into a meat packing plant at the end of the runway there in Seattle. And it spooked the men and they were refusing to fly it. Tibbets was in charge of getting this plane, which was so essential to the war in the Pacific. It could go to high altitudes, it could pressurize, and it could carry a heavier bomb load than anything else we had. He had to get that plane in the air, had to get pilots in it. And so he decided the best way to do it was to get a couple of girls to fly it and prove to the men that it was safe to fly. The women there are Dee Dee Mormon, and the second woman, third from the left, is Dora Dougherty Strother McCune, who is actually one of the women most featured in my book. Dee Dee and Dora, I had a chance to interview both of them. They're about my height. They're about 5'5". So they're not, giant women. They're not 6 foot tall. They're, not super strong, but they're flying this huge 4-engine plane. Tibbets, who I got a chance to talk to as well, he's a very nice, funny man. He loved this project. He spent, several days training the women, and then they spent 2 weeks going base to base training men on it. And until they were kicked out, members of Congress called and made them get out of the plane because they were shaming the football players by having these little girls fly the plane, was the language that was used. But Tibbets thought it was hilarious. He thought this was a great trick that they played on the men, and he and Dee Dee and Dora remained lifelong friends. He worked really hard to advocate for the women and was a real advocate. This gives you a little scale. This is a tail of a B-29, some women sitting on it, just to give you a scale of how big this plane is. I do want to emphasize that 38 of these women were killed during the war, and quite tragically. The WASP were disbanded in December of 1944 before the war was over for lots of reasons. Some, the war was moving forward. Of course, we had taken back Paris and were moving through Europe and heading towards Germany. They're disbanded in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge, though, so it was very disturbing. Because they were technically civilians, they were not recognized as veterans. They did not get the GI Bill. They did not get the any access to VA hospitals, despite any injuries they might have received flying. So in the 1970s, they had a grassroots effort and fought to be recognized as veterans. You see, that's actually a petition. This is very old-fashioned before change.org, and they got handwritten signatures and presented them to Congress in 1977. And they were finally recognized as veterans. The man there on the fourth from the left, standing on the floor, is the son of General Hap Arnold, who of course had advocated for the women, but died in 1950. So he was there to kind of carry forward his father's promise. In 1992, the WASP voted to establish the National Archives at Texas Women's University, and I am officially the luckiest historian because I work in a building not far from here on the campus as a professor and get to use the archives all the time, so very lucky. In 2009, President Obama signed the bill granting them the Congressional Gold Medal. And I'll go to this so you can see the Congressional Gold Medal that they received in March of 2010. Thousands of people were there. You can still find it on C-SPAN if you're interested. And the thing that the WASP would want me to make sure to emphasize to you is to remember that they were the first. They were the first American women to fly U.S. military aircraft, and they were proud of that fact, and they were proud to inspire others. And that's my little talk to give you a little background, and let us go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks.
Wonderful images. And as a researcher, I'm always out there searching for those images, and then all the different interviews and that you've conducted. So in '93, you all of a sudden became interested in who are these women pilots, and then that was kind of educating and informing yourself, and then eventually you start to share that information with the world. And then eventually documentaries and presentations and a book. Can you talk a little bit about your process over the years?
Yeah, well, thank you. It was an accidental meeting in 1993. I ran into a WASP at an air show and had never heard of them, and just thought that was ridiculous, and started down my research path, reading whatever I could. And then I decided I wanted to write their history, but I wanted to do it the right way. So I started graduate school as a history major, never thinking I'd be a professor or anything like that. I wanted to learn how to do history the right way.
Wow.
Went on and got my PhD, and so did my thesis and dissertation on different parts of their story. And then, yeah, since then have had the opportunity to do different documentaries and give talks and write articles for different magazines and different things. Because my goal from the beginning, from that day in '93, was to share their story as widely as possible. To tell, I just don't ever want to walk into a room where nobody has ever heard of them before, because they did so much and they were so inspiring. So that's kind of been my guiding principle ever since.
The women, tracking down these women pilots, I assume you were in your car traveling, or maybe on planes traveling to meet these women. Can you give us a couple examples? Were they excited? Were they willing to share their story? And what about their families? Were the families aware of all that they did, or was some of the family members and friends surprised about their role in World War II?
I think those are great questions, Ghlee. One of the things about these women is, with any group, this, you do research as well, is this idea that you've got to have a gatekeeper, somebody to say that, okay, this person's okay, and we can welcome them into our group. And that first WASP I met had served as that. Carol Bailey Bosca was her name, and she served as that for me. She invited me to an air show where the WASP were being honored, getting into the National Aviation Hall of Fame, actually. And, at that event, I did my first few interviews, one with Caro and a few other WASP, but it wasn't easy. I had to prove myself. There were a couple of WASP who ended up being good friends years down the road that said, why should we talk to you? Why are you different? And at that moment I was grateful I had a good advisor who told me I should be able to explain why in 50 words or less. So that helped.
Yeah.
But I just kept showing up, and I just kept helping and letting them know I was there to not tell their story sensationally, but to really get the whole story. And that was really important to the women, that I wasn't trying to use their story for anything, that I was trying to kind of be a vessel for them to help share their story. The second part of your question was about their families, and I've always found that interesting as well. Is a lot of the families I talked to in the early days, the kids of the women told me they didn't even know their moms had done it. The parents are, you're busy, you're raising your kids, you can't necessarily, you're not going to talk about what you did. So as the years went on, they were more, knew more, and some of them grew up knowing their moms were pilots. But the kids have become huge advocates, and the grandkids have become huge advocates of the women in the years since, and are to a person very, very proud of their mothers and grandmothers.
Wonderful. You mentioned to Mr. Tibbets, who's helped training through your travels and the whole research over the years. Were you able to interview some World War veterans, men, some male pilots, and what was their thoughts, their reactions, their feelings about these women pilots?
Yeah, that's a great question too. General Tibbets and I got to know each other fairly well when I was in graduate school, and he, of course, was incredibly supportive of these women, and just thought they were terrific and talked about them a lot. I was also able to talk to a pilot who flew with Jackie on a number of her flights, and he talked about what a good pilot she was and gave me some personal tidbits and things like that. I think you have men like who just flew with the women and supported them. We've got oral histories with some who were flight instructors and others who were ferry pilots with the women. And they too, there was always some jealousy and some problems on different bases, but those who actually flew with the women really seemed to admire and respect them as good pilots.
Wonderful, wonderful. Did the women that you talked to, did many continue to fly, at least recreational? Did any turn professional pilots?
Right. I think that's a good question too. A lot of them certainly wanted to keep flying. A number of them in the years right after the war were able to work as flight instructors, or some of them opened their own aviation businesses, fixed base operations they're called, and owned their own things. One WASP Haydu owned a Cessna dealership, which is a brand of plane basically, and so she sold Cessna aircraft. The women were not allowed to be airline pilots. The airlines just refused to hire them. They had plenty of men pilots coming in after the war, and they just chose not to hire women. And they told them, we're not hiring you because we don't hire women. It wasn't a hidden thing. It just, nope, we don't hire women. So that path was lost. The women also weren't able to serve in the military as pilots anymore. They were invited back into the Air Force and once the Air Force was created after 1947, and over 200 of them served, but they couldn't serve as pilots because they were women. So you have a lot of them working as flight instructors and stuff, some going on and doing air races and flying recreationally, but it's expensive and it's hard when you're busy with kids. So a lot of them actually come back in the 1960s after their kids are grown and they have a little more time for themselves and start flying again.
Wonderful.
So yeah, it's a lot of fun to watch them.
Wonderful. Over the years, did you have any surprises? Something that came out of left or right field and think, oh, wow.
Yeah. There's so many examples. I think my favorite example, and I never know if it's such a geeky thing that was such a big deal for me. And it was just in the last year or two, as I was finishing up the book, that for years, the story had been that Nancy Love and Jackie Cochran, those two leaders, had never met each other before. That they hadn't met until, sitting in, Colonel Robert Ould's office in 1941 talking about this program. But I found a photograph, talking about photographs, I found a photograph I'd seen 100 times of Jackie Cochran shaking Eleanor Roosevelt's hand when she was receiving an award. And it was always this cropped picture. And I found the original photo of it that was zoomed out. And Nancy Love was standing in the background, rolling her eyes. And from there, I was able to prove that they knew each other as early as 39. I was able to prove from there that they had belonged to the same country club, the Long Island Aviation Country Club, before the war as well. So it, one of those little details that you can get from a photograph can shift your whole perception of their relationship, where it's not just this conflict because they disagree about something. This is personal. They know each other. They've been in the same room. They've eaten at the same table. So there's little things that can change everything. And again, I don't know if that's just a geeky thing for me, because it was so surprising. It was so surprising. One of those shout out moments. So it was a lot of fun to find.
Yeah. Something fun, a lot of folks who are participating, they're writers, or they want to write, or they're in the process of learning. What is your writing environment? Do you write in your work office? Are you at home? Do you like loud music? Do you have to have everything perfectly silenced and so forth? What is that about? Those
are great questions. I think it depends on the time. I work in my home office to kind of keep my school office separate. Right. And I'm lucky enough, of course, to have a space at home where I can do it. And I started this history, this is a nonfiction. So everything I have, every sentence you read in that book is based on 3 sources. So it's all it's lots of paper and documents and that sort of thing. A lot of times I like to play World War II music to kind of get me in the mood, right? I've got a CD of a clarinet playing it, so it's just musical, no words. And then Pandora on the web plays classical music for studying. Yes. So I like that, just a little something in the background to keep you moving. And it's so hard to keep your tush in the chair,
Yes.
and to do it. And I think my advice would be to just be stubborn. And I never really set hard goals, 1,000 words a day or something like that, which I think works for a lot of people. But yes. I would look at the topics and, okay, I want to write about this idea today or this event today. And then find the sources and work through the stories. And some days you have a lot of words, and sometimes it's just a lot of thinking.
Yes.
And thinking counts as a writing day, even if you don't type words. The thinking counts. And so that was the hardest lesson for me to learn, was that's a productive day if you've figured something out, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I would think.
I agree. And I don't think people talk enough about thinking. Mm-hmm. And I went to a presentation by Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, and it was, I don't know, 400 or 500 people, and I wrote a question down, and they happened to ask the question. I said, well, what do you do? Describe a typical day. And including that, what she said was, well, and I think a lot. And I thought, oh my goodness, it's okay to say that out loud, because I spend a lot of time thinking, whether it's 5 a.m. or 11 o'clock at night, or I'm out there weeding the garden or walking a dog and so forth, and thinking. And people forget that we're constantly thinking about what we're trying to get on paper.
Right, exactly. And I think that's good to get out of your space, just because if you're at a block sitting in your office or wherever you write, if it's your kitchen table or whatever, going for that walk, or taking a long shower, or whatever it takes to just kind of relax into the thinking sometimes can make a difference.
Now, for many years, of course, you have been making presentations and documentary and so forth, but when that book was finally published, friends and family with their champagne bottles,
Yeah.
photo and so forth?
Well, I had a very big party planned for about 6 months, and we were going to have cake,
Yes.
and we, had it all planned. Of course, then the pandemic hit.
Same
And
thing with
so,
me.
yeah, right?
No
Everything
parties.
shut down. You can't, so it was a very different book release, and I know you experienced the same. But the technology that we have, I feel so fortunate. I was able to Zoom with my family, so we all had a champagne
Wonderful.
toast.
Oh, wonderful.
And things like that. So it wasn't quite the big party that I had planned to, I've belonged to a book club and I have lots of friends who've been supportive, and that would have been great. But it was meaningful to have the people who traveled the whole journey with me,
Absolutely.
celebrate it with me. So it's it wasn't the bigger party, but
Right.
it's
We'll
still
eventually
incredibly
get our
meaningful.
parties.
Huh?
We'll eventually get our parties.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. And it was very intimate, and it was nice. So
Good.
it's all
Good.
good.
Wonderful. Leslie, do we have any questions from the audience?
That was great. Thank you both so much. We do have a few questions. Our first question is from Court McKee, who had written us that her aunt had been one of the founding members of the Women's Auxiliary Ferry Squadron. Her name was Katherine Rawls. She was also an Olympic swimmer and diver. And so she wanted to hear a little bit more about that and when the ferry squadron morphed into the WASP.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I'm so tickled to have her here. Those original women were so important. So Nancy Love starts the WAFs, which is the group of women who are flying with the ferrying squadron, in September of 1942. And basically it all starts at once. Nancy announces it, and the War Department announces it one day, and the announcement comes out that the training program is starting the very next day. And the purpose of it was, and a lot of times it gets presented as two separate things, and it's really not. It was a group of very qualified women, and Katherine Rawls was such a unique and special individual. I'm tickled to have a relative of hers a part of this. And they had a lot of experience, and they were ready to jump right in. And the training program was started right away to expand the number of women who would be able to go in and join the ferrying squadron. So those first women who graduated from the training, they graduated in April of 1943. They became WAFs, right? They became a part of that ferrying squadron. And then it's in August of 43 that enough classes had graduated and the Army Air Forces wanted to expand that program to the towing of targets and different jobs. So that's when the program expands. So everybody up to that August of 43 was just a ferry pilot or in training to be a ferry pilot. And then the name change happens in August of 43, July, August of 43, because it was no longer appropriate to call them ferry pilots, a ferrying squadron, because they were doing more. One of the most important things about those early ferry pilots, and Katherine Rawls was certainly one of those, is that they proved that women could do it. It was everybody was watching, are these girls really going to be able to fly these things? And Nancy Love and Betty Ghlee spent a lot of time pushing to get into more advanced airplanes, to expand the amount of work that the women could do. So it was a really important group to kind of prove that women could do it.
Another question from Paula Frasio. In your research, was there a common theme in how the women got their flight experience prior to joining the program in Texas?
Right, I think that's a great question too. It changed over time. There were 18 training classes, and it really changed a lot. The earlier women, a lot of them flew on their own. A lot of them were very wealthy. You have the heirs to the Woolworths and things like that were a part of it. But you also have women who earned their way into becoming a flight instructor, and women who weren't as wealthy. But there was also a program in the late 1930s called the Civilian Pilot Training Program. And that was something that was created as a war preparedness program to expand the number of pilots we had. but it was also, there was enough isolationist and anti-war people in the United States in the late 1930s that members of Congress argued, look, this isn't a war training program. This is a help the aviation industry out of the Depression program. So we'll prove it by letting one woman into every class of 10. So 40% of the women who served in the WASP actually learned how to fly in that civilian pilot training program, that government paid program to learn to fly. So it was a really, it was fortuitous to those women, because you could get women of all financial status into the program that way.
You talked a lot about how thinking is being productive. It counts as being productive. I wondered if flying helped you do research, and being a pilot yourself, how that informed this book and knowing what it is actually like to be at the controls of a plane.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that question. I think the flying, I didn't get to fly the planes they got to fly, obviously, the very cool planes, but I think the biggest thing that it did, even before I became a pilot, I started my research before I was able to get my license. The language changed with these women when I was doing my oral histories. Once they knew, I understood the passion, right? Once they knew I wanted to hear about, certain things about the flying, about the movement, about the emotion of the flying and how it makes you feel. And then when I became an actual pilot, we could have even deeper conversations about how to fly and how to train. And I had the great chance over the years to go with the women to a number of air shows, including the EAA has a great air show in Oshkosh, Wisconsin every year. And I got to get into a lot of those warbirds because I was with them. And I got to, a B-17, you put your arms out and you can hit either side of the walls, which sounds ridiculous because it seems like such a big plane. That's what's behind me is the B-17. It's like, it seems like such a big plane, but it's not. And so I think actually being in the planes and going for rides and hearing them and feeling them and knowing what it means to take off and land, it really did add to the depth of my understanding, and I think my passion for it and the women's willingness to share their stories with me in a slightly different way than if I hadn't been a pilot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, Kate, we really appreciate you joining us today. Ghlee, thank you so much for facilitating this conversation, and thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate your participation. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day and takes good care.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you very much, everybody. It was lovely. Thank you for having me.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.